Probably. Second. Now, you all, like, wow, you could get through the first talk. Like, we have a handheld, but I'm going to stand there because that's what the slides are. I'm done. Stand over there, sit over there until the rest of you. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And you've got all the PowerPoints on yours. Yeah. Okay.
Do you want us to sit over there then while you're talking? Because you're right, we're just going to be in the shot.
You don't yawn or anything. Wake
Do
me
you
when it's
want to go second?
Nope.
No, I'm talking to Kevin.
I think it kind of fits. So.
Because mine is like kind of, like not
I
totally.
mean, I think
yours is
they
like
all
direct.
kind of, we are live.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. How many?
Two. That was
Two?
just a test. It took us off. Well, it's 3:30. We might as well jump in. We're ready to go. All right. Well, excellent. Thank you all for coming. It's good to see you, and thank you also to those who are watching remotely or maybe watching this later when you've got a little bit more time. It's good to see everyone here, and thank you for coming. My name is John Walcott. I'm joined up here by my colleagues, Sarah Leo, Kevin Timpey, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves later. But again, welcome to everybody who's here or watching remotely or watching via a recording. We appreciate your interest in the event. The format is going to be like this. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then I'm going to jump into the first presentation. We're each going to take, we didn't time it out too well, but the goal was 15 minutes plus or minus. We'll see who ends up on the plus and who ends up on the minus side of that. And then we're going to open it up for questions. And at that time, I'll give here in this room, old-fashioned raise your hand. For people watching remotely, I'll have instructions on how you can access a way to submit questions. So let's get started. By way of introduction, and this does not count in my 15 minutes, this is the introduction. I started thinking about and planning this event last December as a part of an op-ed that I submitted to the Calvin Chimes, the university newspaper. And in that op-ed, I wrote an article in response to the visit we had here on campus of former Secretary of Education and Calvin alum Betsy DeVos. And there was an event hosted here on campus as a part of a promotional book tour. And in my article, I highlighted some concerns I had with the educational policies and proposals that she's advanced and has continued to support. And in that, I called for more conversation and a deeper engagement about these issues. So that's what we're here for today. This is the more conversation and deeper engagement. But it's not just, it's not meant to be a response to that only. More importantly, we're responding more generally to important policy issues that have been part of the educational landscape for decades. But also that are really relevant and important today as state legislatures, and recently the US Congress has picked up. They are focusing on ed policy issues in a way that has rarely, if ever, happened in our country before. And so these proposals relate to school curriculum, what can and can't be taught, what books can be in classrooms and libraries, issues related to gender identity, special education, school choice, school funding. So that's the context is in terms of ed policy. There's a lot to dig into, it's complex, and so we're gonna get started there. So now I can start my clock. All right. So my presentation is gonna focus primarily on current debates and legislation related to school choice in general and vouchers in particular. And I wanna provide some background. I'm gonna structure this through a series of questions that I hope will introduce some things that I think we ought to be talking about. Hopefully you're gonna find I'm gonna offer some hopefully helpful answers to those questions and open space for more conversation. And end by raising even more questions. I'll move quickly, so I'd encourage you to take notes about anything you wanna raise during the question and answer. I don't have time to dig into everything. To start, I'm gonna put one question on here that I'm gonna save for later. But let's just keep this in the back of your mind. What is our vision for education in our society? All right. Questions. To start with, why school choice? We have to recognize that over the years, advocacy for school choice has come from many different people. It's been supported by a diverse range of people, has been motivated by many different things. But I think an overview of factors influencing school choice is helpful. To begin with, you can't deny that we recognize that public schools, as an essential institution for society, support for public schools began to decrease as the civil rights movement gained support. Second, there's no denying that school choice in general, but specifically the idea of school vouchers, came up as a response to efforts to desegregate schools. Vouchers were started as a way to escape the public school system and to finance racially segregated schools for white people. So that's one of the motivating factors that has been there. Secondly, education reform. Historically, the often poor conditions of public schools available to many people, especially low-income students and students of color, have fueled calls for reform, including school choice. Today, we continue to see this narrative about school choice as a way to increase opportunities for all students. Support of private schools. Efforts to use public funds to support private schools have often been behind pushes for school choice. Profit. There's a long history of people leveraging school choice policies as a way to make money. Think of for-profit charter schools, for example. And finally, the privatization of public schools. School choice has been used as part of that. The playbook has been pretty clear over the years for some people. Some people call this the 4 Ds of privatization. It's disinvestment, demoralize, defund, dismantle. For some school choice advocates, this has been part of the goal all along. Again, not for all. But for example, Milton Friedman, an economist that many people might call the father of school vouchers, openly argued that government should not be responsible for educating kids. And just 15 years ago, well, I guess it's about 17 years ago now, he said the ideal way would be to abolish the public school system and eliminate all the taxes that parents have to pay for it. But at the bottom of this slide, I think this is an important point that John Hale made in a book that he wrote just a couple years ago. School choice is more than mere policy. It's an ideology and a way of thinking about public schools, or I would say thinking about education in particular. So I want you to keep that in mind. Quickly, what do we mean by school choice? Lots of options. I'm not going to talk about these, but I want to frame it. The school choice menu, magnet schools, which are special schools with specialized curriculum, vouchers, which take per pupil funding and give it to parents to use in the school of their choice. I lump tax credits and educational savings accounts in here. They're different, but they act in much the same way. When we think about tax credits, it's this idea of a tax credit that funds scholarships to cover educational expenses, including private school tuition. Michigan, history with that, and that it was tried here. At this point, it failed. It's kind of not in route now. Kentucky recently passed something, and there it was declared unconstitutional, but it's a part of the menu. Educational savings accounts are used in several states. It gives money directly to parents, and they use it to pay for a variety of educational resources, curriculum materials, tuition, tutoring, etc. And then we have charter schools, which have been around for a long time, publicly funded, taxpayer per pupil funding, but privately run. Homeschool has always been an option, and of course private schools, including religious schools. So that's kind of a summary of the school choice menu. Now, got to move this one too. So what do we know about school choice? First of all, once again, people could be in favor of school choice or vouchers for a lot of reasons. So what we know about school choice doesn't necessarily give us the final answer on things, right? So we have to keep that in mind. But I think it is a needed background for authentic discussion of school choice policies. So first of all, research would say that in general, talking about vouchers, we see the negative impact on student achievement. 20, 25 years ago, there was some reports of modest success, but these were in limited programs. In universal school voucher programs, we haven't seen that. Since then, research has pointed to null or negative effects, and in the last 5 to 8 years, studies have had large negative effects. MSU professor Josh Cowan, ed policy professor who has been involved in the research for more than 20 years, has compared these negative effects to what would be experienced in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and currently after the COVID pandemic. So among education research, that question is not being debated a lot anymore. Negative results for historically underserved student populations. That doesn't mean it happens there everywhere, but studies, for example, a study in the Milwaukee program in Wisconsin, where you had, it's one of the oldest and most well-known, a report that came out of there said that historically disadvantaged students were less likely to use vouchers and more likely to leave their voucher sooner than others. They found that low-income and black students left voucher schools at the highest rates and experienced academic improvement after they returned to the public school. School characteristics. Limited access to quality schooling opportunities. Again, in Milwaukee, over a period of almost 20 years, they found that 41% of the private voucher schools closed. Studies have pointed to alarmingly high closure rates among charter schools across the nation as well. Recent study found an 18% closure rate after 3 years, jumped to 40% by year 10, and 50% by year 15. Furthermore, closure rates were higher in high poverty areas. So again, it doesn't answer it for every area, but it's just something we have to keep in mind. Most importantly, though, I think in the current context, it's important to realize that even under the best of circumstances, there are not enough good quality private schools to ensure that school choice is available to all students, or to guarantee that even with a voucher, a low-income family would be able to afford one of those good quality private schools. Negative impact on educational funding. Recent reports have shown, for example, that in 7 states that have increased voucher funding, funding for public schools has decreased. And I'm not talking about overall funding, but per pupil funding has decreased. For example, in Arizona and Florida, funding dropped 5.7% and 12%, while voucher spending increased in each case, plus or minus close to 300%. Florida is one of the most recent states to pass a universal voucher bill. The Education Law Center estimates that it's going to cost $4 billion to Florida in the first year, and half that money will go to students who are currently in private schools. And we know impact on school segregation rates. The UCLA Civil Rights Project has been doing research for many years on a lot of issues in education, school discipline, segregation, etc. They found that 70% of African American students in charter schools are attending intensely segregated charter schools, double the rate in public schools. In 2017, 17% of charter schools were intensely segregated compared to 4% of public schools. And then finally, lack of accountability. This is not a research question, but we know that recent legislation passed or being considered in many states has very clear legislation highlighting that private schools receiving the funds do not have the same level of accountability as currently exists in traditional public schools. Accountability related to financial transparency, academic accountability, and the need to follow all federal anti-discrimination laws. Again, it's not the case in every place, but that is what we're seeing in many places. All right, so I'm not trying to make the argument that all this information shows things one way or another. I think it does show we have reasons for concern about recent school choice legislation, and I think it should lead us at a minimum to recognize that it's problematic and potentially to see that it could be dangerous and harmful. It undercuts the role, I think, that based on this research and other types of concerns, what are some reasons where we might be opposed to the recent legislation? Well, first, the marketplace ideology that is often quoted in this emphasis on individualism. We might argue education's not a business. It's a community service and a right. Current legislation creates a system based on consumer mentality, and it reflects individualism. It undercuts the role of public schools as a common good, as a community enterprise. I like this quote from political theorist Benjamin Barber. He says, "Vouchers transform what ought to be a public question, what is a good system of public education for our children, to a personal question, what kind of school do I want for my child?" Secondly, increases inequity and segregation. We've talked about the segregation, but I think we also see, I like the analogy given by Dave Dennis, a civil rights activist from the 1960s. School choice provides a raft for the few who can escape the sinking ship of public education. The remaining families, majority black, brown, and poor, are left on the ship as the nation watches, critiques, and largely refuses to extend a helping hand. So there's concerns about the equity that we are promoting here. Budget implications we've already talked about, but we need to recognize that as that money is funneled away from public schools, it's leaving them underfunded and unable to meet the needs of the students that they have. Exclusion, discrimination. I know Kevin's going to talk a little bit more about that, but school choice challenges one of the basic premises of education in the U.S., and that is that our schools are available for everyone. It's just simply not the case in the policies that are being advanced today. Advocates like to use the language of civil rights, saying education is the biggest civil rights issue of our day, or school choice is the biggest civil rights issue of our day. I heard this from others, would say civil rights is the biggest civil rights issue of our day. And unfortunately, I'm not convinced that the current legislation picks up on that. At the end of the day, it's complex, right? The questions are complex, but let's see if we can keep it a little bit simple. I wouldn't stand up here and argue, yes, we ought to have charter schools, no, we ought to have charter schools. Or yes, we ought to have vouchers, or no, we ought not to have vouchers, although that one maybe is a little clearer. The problem is a lack of commitment to a system that provides high quality, well-financed schools for all kids. We don't have that. We've never had it. So we do need to improve, no doubt about it. But the current legislation does nothing to address that issue. So until we are committed to addressing that issue, I don't think that we should jump in and say, hey, we need to go there. All right, just some final questions. And amongst these questions, I'm going to actually raise a lot of other questions. So I'd like you to kind of keep track of the questions and how you want to do that. First of all, a question that's not on the page. In an institution that supports Christian schools, we say, yeah, but what is the implications for Christian schools? So I'll just quickly say, yes, a lot of the current legislation would put money into the pockets of people sending their kids to Christian schools. And in the eyes of some, that would be righting an injustice because they think that's the way it should be. That's a question we could raise. My question is simply, at what cost? Current proposals would increase current educational inequalities, do harm to public schools and their students, and stand in the way of pursuing educational justice and equity. We may agree, or at least we could discuss, that there needs to be changes to the way education is funded in our country, related to private schools, public schools, whatever. But in a country that has long neglected the educational needs of certain parts of our community, I don't think the place to start is by cutting funding for our public schools. Other questions. Go through these rapidly. What are the implications for schooling in a democratic society? So just think about these. Should it matter that support for public school is mandated by all 50 constitutions of 50 states? Should a focus on parents' rights ignore the fact that public schools are public institutions created to support the community? What does it mean that public schools should be open to all? Does it matter in a democratic society that voters have never voted in favor of proposals to enact school vouchers? Since 1972, 11 times referenda have been put on ballots and each one has been rejected. It's why what we're seeing now is state legislatures. Iowa was one state that recently passed a proposal. Polls in Iowa show 62% of voters are against the proposal. So the people passing these things know that their voters are not in favor of it. Does that matter to us in a democratic society? What is our priority? Choice or rights, and whose rights? The current narrative highlights options, choice, having options. But I would just ask, I ask myself this, what about the right to a high quality, well-funded education? Is it okay to prioritize my right to have options if it infringes on someone else's rights to a quality education? What sort of freedom should we prioritize? In opposition to the kind of educational freedom we're hearing about today, law professor Joshua Weisart talks about children's freedom to become full and equal citizens, children's freedom to learn in a democratic, integrated, and transformative settings. And finally, is it most important to talk about failing schools or failing schools? And that's not a typo. The narrative we have is about how our schools are failing. But what about if we talk about the way we are failing our schools? We have an achievement gap. Gloria Ladson-Billings frames it as an education debt. The historical debt we have, the economic debt in funding disparities, the socio-political debt, the degree to which communities of color are often excluded from the civic process. And to me, the most important one, the moral debt, the disparity between what we know is right and what we actually do. So I think we need to frame it that way. So I close just by saying, is there a shared vision that we can agree on? To me, I'm just gonna, 3 statements. I think a shared vision starts with a commitment to education as a human right and a basic community responsibility. It's a commitment to the pursuit of justice and equity for all members of the community. And it requires authentic choice, right? That demands that everyone's choice includes high quality, well-funded schools for all children. Save your questions for later. I think we agreed that Kevin's coming up here next.
Thank you, and thank you for putting this together and inviting me to be part of it. So, 15-minute timer for my own good. I'm not teaching this semester, so like I've got all these extra words that could make me go really long. All right, so I want to talk about private education, lack of legal protections, and disability exclusion. And the central thesis of what I want to talk about today and sort of argue for and motivate is that current pushes for educational choice, and that's one way that the language is used, that would enable vouchers to be used especially for private schools. So again, this is a subset of the kind of options that you were talking about, would lead to disability discrimination and exclusion. And if you think disability discrimination and exclusion are bad things, then that's a reason, maybe not an overwhelming reason, to not favor the current push. So I'm going to have 3 main points. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the need for systemic protections and why individual choice and individual efforts aren't enough. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about legal protections for disabled students at public schools versus at private schools. And then, if I have time, I want to sort of bring some of this home with like an actual example of how this plays out in real time. We'll see if I've got time for that. So, The next batches of slides are just following these 3 points of my agenda. So first on the need for systemic protections. When we have something that's a systemic disadvantage, right, or a kind of systemic oppression, then what we need are systemic remedies. Individual choices aren't the kinds of things that are going to be sufficient to address these sorts of patterns. I can't see some of my notes over there, and I've got notes in the PowerPoint and notes on my tablet, so I gotta use multiple tech here. So okay, let me see if. So what we are going to need for systemic problems are systemic solutions. Right? That's just sort of the baseline idea. We see this in part in recent debates about what happens especially to poor schools as vouchers come in, or the ability to take public education dollars out of schools, right, disproportionately affects rural and poor communities. Right? Because when it comes down to it, this is an NBC News story that was just out 2 weeks ago, something like that. There's a district in Texas that only has about 200 students. And when you take $6,000 per student, which is about their public education funding, out of that district, right? You take 5 students out, there goes a teacher, or 6 students, or 7 students, right? And we're not going to be able to solve systemic problems like proper teacher support by having just individual issues. You were very, very gentle on the racist origin of private school vouchers. And actually, this is probably an overstatement by Forbes. There are, in fact, sort of pushes for private schools and private school vouchers that antedate desegregation in the South. But they really ramped up huge after that. Following the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, right? Separate but equal is never equal. School vouchers became a popular tool for perpetuating the segregation the court had ruled unconstitutional. Southern policymakers throughout the 50s enacted legislation that would set up tuition voucher or grant programs for the explicit purpose of taking the monies out of public schools to fund white-only schools in the South. Between 1954 and 1964, Southern legislatures enacted as 450 laws that would block, postpone, limit, or even evade public school desegregation. And when they realized that they were losing the court battle for doing that in public schools, the impetus to increase the exodus from public schools to private schools to enable racial segregation went up. The 11 states that formed the former Confederacy enrolled somewhere between 675,000 new and 750,000 new white students in private schools in the early 1980s. An estimated 65 to 75% of those students were in schools that were 90% white or more. There's a historic and present danger that the push for vouchers, especially if those school vouchers can be used to fund education at private schools, will contribute to discrimination that is already made against marginalized people groups, right? And we see this historically with respect to race, and this is exactly what we should expect with respect to disability here in a minute. But it's not just those issues. Actually, this is a recent Supreme Court decision, Carson versus Macon, which in Maine allows public taxpayer dollars to pay for tuition at private religious schools that offer explicitly religious instruction. Now, this, I don't think, has gone, all the legal challenges, I don't think, are all the way out. But the 2 private schools that are at the heart of Carson v. Macon admit in their Supreme Court documents that the reason for them is to, admit in their Supreme Court arguments that they intentionally discriminate against LGBTQ communities. And in fact, that's a feature of their version of Christianity, not a bug. right? And so you've got in Maine public school funds that are going from taxpayers to private religious schools that will not allow LGBT students, Q students, to be there. And so again, this is, I think, just a feature of the way that historically this has played out with respect to lots of kinds of marginalization. So now, second primary push here. This is what we should expect given the way that this has played out with respect to disabilities in the US. Even when the Supreme Court's decision came down in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and the Supreme Court recognized that segregation on the basis of race was problematic, it was still legal to segregate students in public schools on the basis of disabilities. And it would remain that way for almost 20 years. It wasn't until 1972, the Mills versus Board of Education of the District of Columbia case, that first granted a federal right to a public education for disabled students. What's super interesting is that there is no law or Supreme Court decision that explicitly says there is a federal right to a public education for non-disabled students, because it's taken for granted. And this decision also established the principle that lack of public educational funding couldn't be used to deny public education for students with disabilities. So according to the Supreme Court decision, disabled students have a federal right to a public education, and part of that federal right is that claims about lack of funding cannot be the basis for refusing to admit or educate students. Hold on to that one. A few years later, oops, I gotta hit the right computer here. 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed. When this was passed, 1 in 8 children in the United States with a disability was completely excluded from public education. So 1 in 8 got no public education whatsoever because in over 23 states, I think, don't quote me on the number, there was no state requirement for educating disabled students. Of those students that did attend public schools, over half of them with disabilities received no accommodation whatsoever for their disability. So 1 in 8 couldn't go at all, and 4 of 8 got no accommodations at all when that law was passed. It was then implemented in 1977, where all students, regardless of disability status, were given the right to a free and appropriate public education. I always want to add an "and" in there. In the least restrictive environment. So the default is always towards education with their non-disabled peers, and anytime you take them out of the classroom or the regular educational environment, you have to justify that. This was updated in 1990 to become the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And so that's where we're at these days. So now there's a federal law, 30-year-old federal law, which actually is violated all the time because enforcement's all sorts of problematic, that requires public schools to take disabled students. There is no requirement whatsoever that private schools admit students with disabilities. If they do admit students with disabilities, they do not have to follow any part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. They're just exempt from that law whatsoever. Most got too many things going on here. Most private schools in the United States are also religious. Religious entities lobbied in 1988, 1989 to be exempt from the ADA. They were successful in being exempt from the ADA. And so private schools not only do not have to follow the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but those private schools that are religious in nature also have a legal exception to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Approximately 15% of public school students in the United States have a disability that is recognized under IDEA for which they get some sorts of accommodations. 15%. Anybody want to take a guess on according to the Department of Education, what percentage of private school students have a disability? It's greater than 1, fortunately, actually. Magdalene? 7. So private schools are less, or have, as a percentage of the population, half the disabled students that public schools have. And of those disabled students that they do have, most of them have requirements for accommodations that are on the lower end side, right? So they might get extra reading help for dyslexia or something like that, but they're very unlikely to have, say, legally blind students, because then the private school would have to provide all their textbooks in Braille, and that comes at significant cost. How am I doing on time? I'm doing pretty good. All right. So this is going to be suitably anonymized, but this is just from a recent case where a family who had a child in a private local religious education environment for over 6 years was told that their student would not be allowed to return to that district the following year. And there is no legal recourse under IDEA or the ADA for that kind of exclusion. Actually, I'm just finding this out, and I need to figure out details, but for schools that received CARES Act funding, right, the Coronavirus Relief Act, and CARES, the CRRES supplemental funding, I believe that the federal government attached non-discrimination requirements to that. And so if a private religious school received CARES or CARES Renewal Act funding, then they are obligated, as I understand it, by the ADA not to discriminate on the basis of disability. So there might be a backdoor into at least some of this, the ADA. But the same family was told, we do not have the resources to provide the supports that this student needs. Remember, under federal law, you can't use the lack of financial resources as the reason to justify this problem. This is in a school district that has a $36 million annual operating budget. And according to last year's publicly available tax forms, had a $58 million net asset pool. But we don't have the resources to provide. And one of the tricky things is, at least for most of the private Christian schools that do take disabled students here in Grand Rapids, there's a requirement that all of the family's children have to go to that school. And so if this family is to send their disabled child to another Christian school, that will require them to uproot all of their children from the same school, and they would not be given the option to keep their children in the school that they are presently in or to send the other children to public school, because there are requirements for admission that allow them to discriminate against not only individuals but the families on the basis of disability status. And that is sort of the function of some of this. So as by way of conclusion, I'm going to take an extra minute. I was super frustrated. Where did I put her book? Actually, there are some parts in here where I surprisingly agree with this book, but I found it really, really frustrating. She writes that American education should never be commanded and controlled by the federal government. It's a direct quote. Page 12. It's only direct demand of the federal government that ever got black students into white public schools, that ended segregation, and that enabled disabled students from across the country to actually get a public education. Sometimes federal interaction is the only way that non-discrimination actually takes place. She also writes, I believe individual schools and districts were, I suppose she still believes this, so are best positioned to provide an appropriate education to the students that they're willing to admit on the basis of their race, or on the basis of their sexuality, or on the basis of their disability status, or on the basis of their economics. If we care about education as a public good, especially looking out for previously historically marginalized groups, we have to care about the way that the push to take public funds into private schools interacts with various kinds of legal protections. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Sarah Leo. I'm a professor in the education department. My presentation is going to feel a bit like a departure. It's a policy issue, and actually it is connected to issues of school choice in that the proponents of a lot of these bans and censorship bills that we're going to look at are sort of the same people who are also advocating for choice. And there's this kind of larger umbrella that this is happening underneath the sort of idea of parent rights and individual freedoms as opposed to ideas about the common good. But it might also offer just kind of a different thing for your brain to marinate on for a little bit. And so we're going to talk about the current realities related to curriculum censorship in the US. And so to start, we're just going to look at basically what is happening related to curriculum censorship and in what ways. So just as a little kind of shocking stat to throw out there for you, proposed educational gag orders, we can call, when we talk about curriculum censorship, we can talk about gag orders, we can talk about sort of book bans, like all these sort of falls under the same kind of category. But proposed educational gag orders increased 250% from 2021 to 2022, and 2021 had already seen a pretty significant increase. But what we're seeing is these attempts at censoring curriculum in schools are falling under kind of two basic categories. The first is related to race, which is fueled by the panic over critical race theory, which sort of got kind of foisted into the national spotlight sort of post-COVID a couple of years ago, and has since kind of expanded, but it's related to basically any kind of conversation that might happen around race and racial justice in a school curriculum. And then the second arm is related to issues of gender expression and sexuality. So you have just a couple of little kind of images up there. Florida kind of started this sort of trend and continues to kind of advance the kind of the ways that we're seeing these bills enacted. Florida is sort of on the front lines, but their Don't Say Gay bill is sort of what kind of catapulted this arm of the curriculum censorship conversation, which blocks teachers from talking about LGBTQ people or issues. And there's a couple of tweets up there that are maybe worth mentioning, and I'll talk about maybe a little bit, but the critical race theory panic was actually started by one dude. And he decided he wanted to become a political pundit and he needed something to get himself some notoriety. And so he sort of made it his personal mission to do a bunch of research about what diversity and inclusion was looking like at the corporate level during COVID, particularly when everything was online. And so he had access to these curricula. And so he took the curricula and then he went into the bibliographies of the curricula and read those pieces, and then found this term critical race theory and decided this is obscure enough that most people aren't going to know what it is, so we can take it and attach everything we don't like to it, and then that will get people all riled up. It's to expand it into the current kind of controversy over wokeness is a sort of new, they've sort of tagged that on. But this is literally tweets from this guy. He doesn't hide this at all. There's a huge New Yorker profile. Go look it up if you if you dare. So let's talk a little bit about where and how these kind of two arms of curriculum censorship are happening. There's sort of like three basic, sorry, need to get my computer going. There's sort of three places where these things are occurring. They're happening in state legislatures, obviously. You can see that the map on the top right talks about or highlights the sort of states in which these gag orders are operational. But almost every state, there's like a few exceptions, has had a proposal at least on the floor of the state legislature to try to restrict curriculum in a particular way, either related to race or related to gender and sexuality. And so you have that kind of aspect of it. You also have the increase in, and this was sort of, there are lots of groups that are sort of funding this kind of increase, but in local school board kind of decisions. So you have, and this is true for libraries as well. So you have individual citizens who are going to school board meetings, many of which they don't even have kids at the school that they're going to the school board meeting of. They just got riled up about something, and so they went in and they want to, they're trying to sort of promote these curriculum bans. So you have these varying groups, sometimes individuals who've been riled up, sometimes organized groups going into school boards, either running for school board seats or just like hijacking school board meetings, trying to get the sort of conversation on the agenda about taking particular types of curriculum out of the public school sort of library. And then you also have, which I think is probably the more concerning aspect for schools of education, you have what we would call the chilling effect. So even schools and communities and cities, and then even into states that don't have like these bans operationalized, like Michigan would be one example, you still have teachers feeling like they can't say certain things. And so there's a study, the headline in the bottom corner talks about a survey of teachers where a lot of them are quoted as feeling like they're walking on eggshells, worried about what parents are going to say. So they're self-censoring, even if there aren't actually current rules like forcing them to censor themselves. And so you have this sort of like these three kind of arms of how the censorship is taking place around the country. So why does it matter that it's happening? Why is this fight worth talking about? Why is it something that teachers, parents, administrators, schools of education, universities at large care about? I want to talk about sort of three kind of angles on this conversation. The first one is related to justice. What we know from heaps and heaps of research is that children as young as 5, 6 years old can demonstrate prejudice based on race, based on gender, et cetera. We've got studies that suggest that infants as young as 6 months old can show preference related to skin color when it comes to behaviors and whatnot. So there's this kind of one thing I hear is sort of, well, little kids don't need to hear about these like really difficult topics like race, or they don't need to be talking about sexism and other isms that we might encounter. And that might feel true, but it actually doesn't, the research doesn't bear that out. We know that kids at a young age can develop prejudice, can enact prejudice, and also obviously can be the victim of prejudice and extreme prejudice. So it matters because there's a justice issue here, that if we care about making sure that kids are safe and making sure that we fight oppression where we see it, then that involves even the elementary school. It's also true that this rhetoric, most of the fear-based rhetoric, I would say, is at least it's heightened around the conversations about gender and sexuality. But fear-based rhetoric harms people. It makes people treat others differently when they feel like they should be afraid of something, because if someone's telling them that, like, we shouldn't talk about this in school and it's dangerous, that affects people's attitudes, and then they go out and enact that in their daily lives. The second thing I want to highlight is just the issue of truth, and that we should care about truth, and that we should want the truth to be part of our curricular project in schools. Education is not indoctrination. I think questioning the premise is important. I mean, first of all, if you've spent time with a child recently, you know that they're very difficult to indoctrinate. I wish I could indoctrinate my child to remember her tennis shoes to take to school. So I think there's this kind of flaw in the argument kind of at its base level, that this idea that even schools have this kind of power, but beyond that, that telling the truth about the world is not the same thing as indoctrinating. And actually, schools of education need to speak up about this because it goes against what we know is good teaching. Good teaching is not indoctrination. Good teaching is question, problem posing. Good teaching is helping students develop critical thinking skills, et cetera. And we're all trained to do that. So the other piece here is that for those who are sort of afraid of these difficult topics, we know that banning, this is a quote from a fairly well-known scholar that I actually heard him speak with a couple of my colleagues several weeks ago, and he had this quote that I wrote down immediately because it felt true to my experience and felt like it kind of cut through some of the discourse. But he says, banning information won't have the result they want. Children will graduate from school and they will find it, and then they will wonder why we betrayed them. Especially in this day and age where information is available instantaneously at our fingertips, to try to even begin to sort of keep information away from kids is in and of itself kind of a faulty prospect. But beyond that, I have my own experience of finding out the truth about the world and thinking about the lies my teachers told me, either inadvertently or explicitly, and saying, why didn't anyone tell me this before? And I felt betrayed. And so I think that having a fierce commitment to the truth is a big part of what it means to be a Christian. It's a big part of what it means to be an educator, period. And I think that the truth doesn't have to be scary. We'll get there in a second. And then finally, I think it's important to worry about this because actually we don't all disagree to the extent that you would think if you just looked at the headlines in the news. Several studies suggest that the majority of parents in the U.S. are pretty satisfied with their kids' education. These are loud voices that are in the minority. And so the majority has to speak up because we're letting certain people control the narrative when the reality is that not only are most parents just kind of either like perfectly content with what's happening at their kids' school and or sort of neutral about it, but there are lots of parents that want schools to do more talking about race and racism and equity, and want students or want their children to learn more about loving people, all people, equally. So that's why I think it matters. It matters for a lot of reasons, but those are a few. This is the fun part, though. This is the part that I enjoy thinking about. The why is it happening? We can disagree on all of these things. I'm going to throw some stuff out for you to consider. I think that, well, first of all, let's not pretend that we haven't always been censoring curriculum. this is not anything new. There's no such thing as neutral curriculum. So no matter what curriculum you're teaching a set of students, there's always going to be some voices privileged and others not. There's going to be some stories told and others not. We certainly know that curriculum has been censored on like a state and national level before. Pre-Civil War, the South was censoring textbooks to make slavery look morally defendable. We know that in the civil rights kind of era, we started looking at curriculum and actually taking out explicit instances of racism and sexism. So we kind of go back and forth, right? There's this sort of ebb and flow, there's this up and down. But the reality is that the myths, the stories we tell about ourselves, the ways that we want to imagine America, our country being, are really powerful. And it's really hard to process, accept, consider information that contradicts that. And so I think there's always that kind of pull whenever we have curriculum censorship conversations. What are the stories we're telling about ourselves? What are we sort of afraid we might lose? Which kind of gets us into the next piece. But one of the ways I like to help folks understand kind of the realities of institutional inequality and how we think, like Kevin talked about, how we need institutional solutions for institutional problems is by having students, whoever I happen to be talking to, think about power. And power, I think, is best understood as having inertia, as falling under the sort of Newton's first law of motion. So if you think about this circle here being as representative of power, political power, social power, whatever. With no outside forces, this object will never move. And also with no outside forces, this object will never stop. Power wants to maintain itself, whether explicitly or implicitly. And so it's helpful to think about how power is operating. In fact, it's not helpful, it's essential that we think about how power is operating if we want to think about why certain things are happening in a society at any given moment. So why is this conversation happening right now? We've undergone a pretty significant period of social and political change, starting, I suppose, with gay marriage being legalized, moving into the Black Lives Matter movement, segueing into the Me Too movement. We have issues of inequality, issues of racism, sexism, et cetera, have been sort of pushed into the national spotlight in ways that they hadn't previously been. And because of that, it's filtered into schools quicker, probably, than it has in the past. Because teachers can go online and say, I want to help my students process all this stuff that's happening, and there's curriculum available for them. So these things that educators have been pushing for a long time are now happening quicker, and might feel like they're happening too quick to some folks. And so it makes sense that there's a backlash. This is just how history works, right? And then finally, I think, I think fear is at the root of most of these types of justice issues where a group wants rights that have been historically denied to them. The group that has to give the rights, the group that has to grant accessibility and grant equality where there wasn't before, is afraid of what that might mean. Change is always scary. I say this sometimes to my students, it's hard to have a country it's hard to be alive and be a human, and things feel scary. And so if you are a person who's enjoyed your place at the center of the circle for a really long time, it's really hard to imagine giving that up, even if you don't realize that's what's going on. And so I think that fear is sort of a helpful way to think about what's motivating these conversations, which brings me to my last point, which is about what can we do? So assuming we agree that these types of curricular gag orders, that these ways in which we're trying to censor teachers from talking about critical issues like race and gender and sexuality and any other kind of inequality we might want to discuss, then there are things we can do. So probably I'll sort of speak to as sort of three levels, depending on who's listening, either in here, obviously online. But for parents, for people who are stakeholders in local schools, engage. Obviously, go run for school board would be great, but if you don't have that kind of time, even just an email to an administrator saying, I really appreciated how my daughter's teacher talked about the civil rights movement in class this week, or I really appreciate the ways in which you're trying to make LGBT students feel welcome at the school, et cetera, right? Doing things that sort of positively indicate that you want more, not less, of these conversations happening in your kid's school. For teachers, we have some pretty good research coming out about the value of like book studies and collaboration among colleagues. So there's lots of resources online to help teachers think about how to incorporate justice issues in their curriculum, but that chilling effect is real. And one of the ways that we can combat that chilling effect is to have teachers work together and read and support each other to say, like, this is worth doing. I'm not going to shy away from this. I'm going to try to fight for the type of schooling, the type of pedagogies that we know are good for students. And then administrators, even if there aren't any in the room, administrators are key. Administrators need to support teachers. Administrators need to have their backs. If angry parents come knocking on the door because they read a tweet and they heard critical race theory is bad, they need to be able to stand up for their teachers and say, this is what we're doing, this is what's happening, here's why it's important, and not just acquiesce to the sort of latest kerfuffle. And I think that probably a question that might cut right to the heart of the matter if someone asks you, why should kids be learning this? Or I don't want my kids to think about these issues is, what are you afraid of? What makes you scared about this? Let's start there. And then we can talk and we can figure out what's really going on. You could also be cheeky and ask them to define critical race theory and watch them squirm. But you could approach it from a gracious perspective or not. So thanks for listening. This was obviously a very kind of overview. I didn't get into specifics about the arguments that are being made, mostly because I think a lot of this is in the public discourse. We're all sort of aware that these things are happening, but we're not necessarily sure what to do about them. So yeah.
Thank you. So I think we recognize the reality. We all felt there was a lot more we wanted to say, and we apologize for rushing a bit. But what I'd like to do at this point is open it up for questions. So, and we're going to whip through this real fast. For those joining online, you've got two options. If you use that URL and put in that code, in case you can't see it, it's 53598710. You'll be able to submit a question. Or if you're a person that likes to use the QR code, go ahead and grab that. For people here in the room, if you want to submit a question that way, that's fine, but raising your hand works just as well. And we'll try to repeat the question up here so that others can hear it. So I'll be monitoring the questions coming in, so if one of you would monitor the audience and point to people, we'll go from there. And we've got a mic right there.
They're convinced.
Questions, go.
Professor Walcott, when you were speaking about the volunteers in school choice, you talked about one of the negative things that we know is the impact on student achievement. Was this recognized in just private schools or just public schools, or was it recognized in a average between all of them on the research?
So, yeah, thank you, Lucas. So the research is looking specifically at, and there's lots of research out there, right? So this is bringing a lot together. But it's looking at students who used a voucher to go to a private school. So as they compared that, said, okay, what happens to learning? And sometimes it was based on reading scores, math scores. They used a voucher. they went to a voucher school, most often a private school, and what were the results on achievement from that?
So Professor Tim.
Yes, participant.
So is there any states that have a law that make private schools have to accept people with disability and have not be able to suspend them or not accept them? Any states in the U.S.?
I am not aware of any state that requires private schools in that state to accept or accommodate disabled students. It will be interesting to see how this plays out if what I said earlier is correct, that schools that received EANS funding actually do have to follow the ADA. I don't know if a claim has been made that way in the courts yet. But to the best of my knowledge, what happens is that schools or parents that want to send their disabled children to private schools have to find a private school that is willing to accept disabled students, willing to accept students with those particular disabilities. I believe, so all of the private religious Christian schools here in West Michigan that I'm aware of that do take disabled students actually place a limit on the number that they actually take. And so even if they take some, there's a certain number beyond which they won't accept more. And so there's not quite a quota system, but a cap system. And there's nothing that there's no state or federal law that I'm aware of that prohibits that.
So this question will come back to you as well from somebody remotely. Under IDEA, what entity is responsible for funding services for students with disabilities in private schools?
In private schools?
Who's responsible for funding?
So this gets tricky. So let me answer a slightly easier question about under IDEA, who's responsible for funding special education in public schools. And when it was passed, the target was that the federal government would pay 40% of the additional cost that it takes for the average disabled student, so that it didn't come out of state budgets, and it didn't come out, or all didn't come out of state budgets, and it all didn't come out of local property tax values. The fact that we tie educational budgets to property tax values, something else for you to think about. And I think that the highest it's ever gotten is 17%. We've never gotten over 20%. We've never gotten to 40%. So right now it happens at the state level. Primarily at the state level. There is provision that if a student at a private school gets therapy services that would be provided in a public school, so not all of the services that they would get, but some of them, those would be given by the public school that the private school is within the boundaries of. And so at that case, it would come out of some out of the federal money that they receive from the Department of Education, but the vast majority comes out of either state budgets or local property tax values that fund public school districts. And when you can see why the economics would push people in a certain way. We don't like to pay more for services, especially if we're the people that receive those services. And there's probably some comment here to be made about American capitalism driving the ideology, but we just don't like to pay for services often that we don't receive. And so we want to push it. There are some private schools that make parents pay the additional cost themselves. So they will take a disabled student, but in addition to the private school tuition, they also have to pay out of pocket all of the costs or a percentage of the costs for those additional services. So it kind of varies.
Another question out here. I've got one here, but so we'll jump to this question. What does the process of banning materials in a public school look like? I could answer that, but Sarah, do you want to answer that since you were talking more about that?
It kind of depends on whether it's coming from like a state initiative, like either something proposed in the state legislature or if it's happening like from the community up, right? Like, so if it's someone going to a school board. But what is happening, and this is, there's some differences in terms of like the processes, but what I'm hearing that's happening most frequently is that all it takes for a book to get pulled off the shelves is someone issuing a challenge. And then what the school will say is, well, we have to go through like a period of review. But because that takes time and effort and resources to gather together some kind of entity to review whether the book is actually problematic or not, what happens is they just take it out to be safe. As long as a book has a challenge, if a book has a challenge, it gets taken out. And then it just sits on a shelf until which time whatever committee that needs to be kind of like summoned can rule on it. Another way that curriculum materials then, so the Don't Say Gay bill is similar to, like, if you talk about it in school, then there might be mechanisms by which someone can report you. And then if you're reported, then you can get I don't know, it depends on how seriously the school wants to take it. But there is just recently in the news, there was a professor at a college in Florida who got fired for teaching a class he's taught for like 20 years. The content hadn't changed, but a student raised an issue, and under the kind of like nitty-gritty of the law, they were able to dismiss this person on that basis. So it's hard to answer like exactly how, and maybe you have John, more information. But I think it depends on the school, and it depends on where the challenge is coming from. But the reality is that oftentimes these challenges are just like, it's like just caught up in kind of bureaucracy. And that ends up having the effect that they want, even if we haven't ruled technically that something is bad.
I'll just add one comment kind of to support Sarah's talking about the chilling effect. A teacher that I've talked to the week before school started this year in the English department of this school, rather than preparing for the school, they were going through and required by their school district to catalog every book in their room just as a way to prevent challenges, having to go through and pull every book and write it up and explain why it should not be banned. That was their activity for getting ready for school, an example of the chilling effect. Other questions? Yes, please.
Talking about school choice, there's obviously draws to those kinds of private schools and other choice schools and things like that. What do you think that it looks like to take those draws and bring them into a public school so we don't see as much flooding away from public schools?
Good question. So what, some of the draws that lead people to go to looking for school choice options, private schools, what would it look like to bring those into public schools? Well, I think it starts with adequate funding. When we think of what I think draws parents to schools and kids to schools, we think of well-qualified teachers. We think of a curriculum that helps kids flourish, right? We think of a minimum amount of time on testing. We think of adequate resources, right? A science lab that's got what it takes. We think of all these things we want to see in schools. So the question is, how do we bring those to all schools? Well, that's a big job. It's a very big job. But I think that's where you start. You say, okay, what can we do to improve our local neighborhood school so that it is an authentic choice? So if a parent wants to say, I'd rather have my child in that Lutheran school up the road, then they will do that. But they will have a quality school right there in their neighborhood available to them. I would think that would be educational equity when we could say that's there for every kid in our city, that's there for every student in our country, et cetera. So I think the draws are what we, think about what we think of as a high quality school now, and then ask ourselves, what's getting in the way of that being the school up the road? And a big part of it is funding. People, that was another popular thing that people liked to say years ago. Why are we taking more money and throwing it at schools? Well, it does matter. The research is clear. The research is clear. People used to say, oh, the research doesn't support that. Well, that's just not true. The research is clear. Increased funding increases student outcomes in schools. And we have never adequately funded public education in our country, at least not for all students. Some schools, yes, but not for all students. So, other questions? Or follow-up if I didn't get that right. Sam?
So going back to the rule that Professor Cindy was talking about, there's like a rule against excluding a student based on financial resources. Is that like can you say more about what law that comes from, and like if there's precedent to make a similar law for like not just people with disabilities, but also like, because there's all sorts of schools that will exclude students for whatever reason, whether they're LGBTQ or if they just aren't up to a certain level of academic rigor. So I'm wondering if that same rule could be expanded more broadly, you know?
So I do not think that public schools are able to deny queer trans students from attending in virtue of being queer or trans. They can't do it in terms of race. And so let me pull up here. It was either the law that for public funding or public schools with respect to disability that does not allow the lack of resources to be used as the reason why a student can't participate in that was in the Mills versus Board of Education of the District of Columbia in 72. I have been in numerous schools where public schools, right, where this is actually the requirement as a disability advocate, when the school staff say, well, this is an accommodation or support we think the student should have, but we can't do it. And then I'm like, well, wait a second, here's the section of IDEA based on this earlier decision where that is disallowed. And technically, according to IDEA, an educational entity's federal funding is at jeopardy if they are in violation of this requirement, right? So if a local public school says we're not going to provide this service because we don't have the staffing, the resources, in principle, all their federal education dollars are in jeopardy, but it's never been invoked. And so even though private school or public schools can't make these decisions on the basis of funding, they actually play out on the basis of funding all the time. But since that law is only about public schools and not private schools, there's nothing that I'm aware of, and I'm pretty sure if there was, there's just not anything that can prohibit a private school from saying, you know what, this student has gone here for the past 6.5 years, but in order to continue to accommodate the student, it would cost us extra X dollars. We don't have those resources. Ignore the bottom line of our actual tax audit stuff. And there's, to the best of my knowledge, no legal recompense for such families. Churches in multiple contexts in the United States have fought for and won the legal ability to discriminate on the basis of disability status. And that's just where we're at.
So they can in terms of disability, they can in terms of LGBTQ. Can they even, do they have a legal right to discriminate in terms of, say, race or?
I confess I don't know the answer if private schools have the ability to discriminate on the basis of race. The way that actually plays out, it does in fact discriminate on the basis of race, but I don't know the legal question. So I'll try to find out.
I believe the answer is that no, they do not have the ability. They cannot discriminate on the basis of race. But that doesn't mean it can't play out that way, right? Because we know, we know the way that in our country, so many things, the intersection of so many different factors. But racial discrimination, they do need to abide by according to federal law.
Which is an interesting question, why that federally protected class is protected in private schools, but other federally protected classes aren't protected in private schools.
Yeah, good question. So you ready for another one here?
Got me towards one of them.
It's kind of toward all of you to make you feel better. So is there anything kids subsidize in private schools can do to make it more like be more allowing for kids with disabilities or other people that such as LGBTQ or that the school is discriminating against. And because I know for a fact that private schools will discriminate against people, and even in their lessons, they will basically plant in the minds of the children they were teaching that LGBTQ and disabled people are kind of less than others.
So the question is are there things that kids in school can do to push back against the exclusion? So I really like the question. So I got to be careful that I don't plant ideas that your father might not approve of. But I am very heartened in this period we're living in. If you think of, and I asked my class this a couple weeks ago, if you think over the last 5 years, it doesn't take long for me to think of the number of times students in school, elementary, high school, have actively stood up for what they believe is right? Walkouts, protests, organizations, and with social media and everything else, they're doing it better, but they are speaking up. So that's one thing. I think kids have a voice, and they need to use that voice. Of course, we need to use it, in a way that's going to be effective and not cause further trouble, that sort of thing, and don't want you to get in trouble. But so that is one thing. I think there is good trouble, and I'm very encouraged by the number of young people. Just in February, a school in Georgia, students walked out after they were being told what they could and could not do to celebrate Black History Month, and they walked out. They organized a protest and staged a walkout and walked out. And we see it on university campuses as well, right? Unfortunately, we have to talk about that. But Michigan State University students going to the Capitol to stand up, for issues that they believed in after recent tragedy. So that's one answer to the question: is students do have a voice. And then borrowing from Professor Leo, the whole collaboration thing I think is really important. There are teachers there who will collaborate with students. Find those teachers, and they'll encourage you too.
I know a teacher at a local private Christian school was told that because some parents complained, they had to remove a Black Lives Matter sign from their classroom. And so then 4 students in that class later that week wore Black Lives Matter shirts, which is pretty awesome. So there are things that people can do, right? You could do a student might choose to do a book report on Judy Heumann's biography for a class, for instance, as a way of highlighting some of those issues.
Another question?
Yeah, so I don't come from an education background, more like applied science history. So I have a question about what, how would you respond to a parent whose main concern about maybe trying to have more say in exactly what kind of curriculum is taught in schools, or trying to move a child from public school to private school, and they're concerned about worldview, what kind of worldview their child is being instilled in. How do you balance the right to childhood education, but then the right to a parent to be able to raise their children in a way that they want to? How would you respond to a parent with those kind of concerns?
Please repeat the question.
So the question is, how do you respond to a parent who's trying to navigate this issue of, I want to raise my child in a particular way, I want them to have a particular worldview or outlook, and I want their education that they're receiving to match that. There's sort of different levels, right? Like, one thing I would say is, you do have, if for the most part, if you want your kid to go to a particular school that reflects your values, you can do that. The question is funding, right? I have one of my kids at a private school. It's not a religious school, but I'm also very happy to continue paying taxes to support all the other kids who need to go to school, right? So there's this outlook piece of saying that, like, what I want for my kid isn't the only thing that matters. And so thinking about, like, sort of that value system and what role does that play in your worldview, right? The second piece would be, and I would say, like, what are you afraid of, right? I think you have to sort of get at exactly what are you worried that your student might be exposed to or not exposed to in this particular setting, and what do you feel that a different setting would offer. And again, I think a lot of times the answer to that question is it's this sort of like unknowable, like I'm worried about what influence another school might have. But I would say as an educator, we train teachers to do good teaching. And good teaching is not indoctrination. Good teaching is not telling students what to think. And so I think that recognizing that like we have a set of trained professionals who have gone to years of schooling and have years of experience and that are being evaluated constantly, and trusting that good pedagogy is not pedagogy that unduly influences students to believe one thing over another, right? That is open and allows them to bring their perspectives and their worldviews and their belief systems to whatever the content is. And so trusting teachers that they are being trained to do that, and asking that question of what is your student experience that makes you think that's not true, I think is another thing I would say. But yeah, sort of those two components, right? Like if you really want that for your child, then do it, but also recognizing like what kind of the broader question is about rights and the common good. And then also acknowledging that good teaching is not about sort of brainwashing. And so that experience of being in a school and being given a worldview might not be as scary as you think, right?
If I can add two things to that. First is parents need to train their children as students to critically evaluate what their teachers are saying in the same way that they need to train their children to critically evaluate what they say, right? And so, I mean, we're going to encounter stuff all the time that is contrary to our worldview. And rather than run from it, learn to criticize it and engage it. And this is the second point, right? Because not all these worldviews are equally compelling. They're not all equally good. They don't have equal evidence for them. Just because a white supremacist parent might not want their kid to learn about the Holocaust, right, as contrary to their worldview, in a public school, the public school should teach that the Holocaust happened anyway. I think that in a public school, Holocaust denialism doesn't deserve a place at the educational table because it's just not on equal historical evidentiary footing. And so part of it is, right, I mean, these issues get complicated in epistemology, and I say this as a philosopher, epistemology is hard. But not every view deserves to be taken equally, and we have to train our students to critically evaluate all the things that they're being taught, exposed to, all the things that they're consuming, including what we ourselves say, and train them to be good consumers of information. Right? And not all of the information that people are scared of is something that they should be scared of. And at some point, there's in the name of a public good like education, you just say that, like, sorry, but your worldview that you're, right, either endorsing or afraid of or whatever, just doesn't have the evidence for it. And sorry, but we're not going to teach Holocaust denialism on par with, right, the racist history of the United States, because it's there. And right, you can read American history in accurate ways and in idealized, right, American first ways. And let's just be honest that they're not equal.
Last question from our esteemed guest.
Not so esteemed. Professor Timpey.
I knew it.
You seem to make the case that vouchers weren't a good idea because Christian schools, private schools, aren't required by law to serve kids with disabilities. Ergo, kids with disabilities could be hurt by vouchers, right? Am I understanding your argument? Or at least part of your argument?
So I've not argued that there shouldn't be vouchers, right? But there is in fact going to be a negative impact of having public funding going to private schools, given current lack of protections in private schools. Yeah. And so there is a significant detriment to an already marginalized population. Now, perhaps that is outweighed by other kinds of goods and other kinds of considerations, right? So this is just a comparative claim that disabled students will be increasingly harmed by taking public funded education funding and giving them to private schools when there is not the parallel to that of anti-disability discrimination.
Yeah, the premise there that I wanted to challenge was that it's the law that drives behavior all the time, right? Obviously, Christian schools that serve children with disabilities well have chosen to do so despite the lack of law. In other words, they have other kinds of grounds, moral law, theology. There are lots of great reasons why Christian schools are buying into the idea of serving diverse learners, right? And the reason they put into place things like a cap, which you framed as discrimination, the reason they put that into place is because so many people are wanting to take their kids out of the public schools where they have protection of law in order to get their kids services as students with disabilities in the Christian schools that are doing it without the law, with a different motivation, and without the flaws in the law that you have spent so much time fighting, right, in the public schools. The law is flawed. The law fails to protect kids in many ways, and the Christian schools protect kids in ways that the federal law does not.
Ideally, Christian theology would be the driving force that would make churches more welcoming. I agree that that should happen. That's not how it played out in U.S. history with respect to race. That's not how it plays out in U.S. history with respect to, right? I mean, institutionally, right? I mean, you have King, right? And you have all sorts of civil rights actors. What's the book that I recently read? The Bible Tells Us So, which is the Methodists and the Southern Baptist response to the Brown versus Board of Education, right? And so the history here is complicated, right? But you have the systematic evasion of justice by Christian denominations with respect to race, with respect to sex, with respect to sexuality, with respect to disability. And ideally, even the local schools that do it best tend to do it best at younger ages than they do at high school. Even the local schools that do it best actually have an outflux of disabled students when it comes to further on into the educational career. Even the local schools that do it best really struggle with it. And even the local schools that do it best at some point say, we don't have the funding, take your kid elsewhere. So yes, there is a moral vision in Christianity that should in fact compel us to actually make the kind of move that you're saying. And sometimes that happens. Right? But it's related to the fact that disabled people are less likely to go to churches than are non-disabled people because the actual churches don't do this well.
Yeah, there's so much to respond to and so many nuances in this conversation that it's bigger than we can deal with here.
Well, thank you. And we can talk, we'd love to talk more, but we probably, for the sake of those who really were planning on leaving by 5 o'clock, we should wrap this up. Although, since I planned this, I will have the last word here too, and that is simply that I think another concern related to that conversation is that with the lack of accountability, it's not those really good private schools we're worried about. It's the, as some authors call, the wild, wild west of how many schools are springing up to take advantage of, and will those schools offer the same kind of protection and value? So it is complicated. It is complicated. It needs deep thought. We appreciate all of you for helping us with that, and thank you to both very much for helping me out with this too. So thank you, and stick around and talk more if you want.